The casserole was still warm when Claire Donovan's neighbors noticed her lights flickering at 2417 Meadowlane Drive. On the evening of November 22, 2010, a cold front moved across southern Illinois, bringing sleet and wind that rattled the bare branches and sent power surges through the grid. At 7:41 p.m., across the street, retired Postmaster Harold Bixby stood at his living room window, watching as the light in Claire's kitchen blinked once, twice, and then steadied. He thought little of it at the time. Everyone in the Meadowlane subdivision had been warned about electrical fluctuations, but when the light remained on long past midnight, casting a pale yellow rectangle across the thin layer of frost that had settled over the front walk, Harold made a note in the spiral-bound notebook he used to track neighborhood disturbances. The entry read only 2417, light on all night. The next morning, Claire's blue Toyota Corolla sat in the driveway under a film of frozen rain. Before we continue this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe and like this video. Your support helps bring these forgotten stories to light, and the algorithm gods will make sure you don't miss any future uploads. Its windshield wipers lifted halfway as if interrupted mid-motion. Her front door was closed, the mail uncollected. At 8:22 a.m., a postal carrier named Melinda Kruger placed a package on the porch, a holiday order from a home goods catalog, and noticed the faint hum of an appliance running inside. She assumed Claire had overslept, still adjusting to her new night shift schedule at the regional hospital. It wasn't until 4:15 p.m., when the same package remained untouched, that Melinda mentioned it to Harold, who called the police non-emergency line. Officer Daniel Creighton arrived at 5:02 p.m., his dashboard camera recording a neighborhood of muted lawns and cautious glances from behind half-closed curtains. Inside, the scene was ordinary at first glance, unsettling only in its completeness. The casserole dish rested on the stove, condensation trapped beneath the glass lid. 2 plates were set on the small dining table, one partially served. A bottle of white wine sat open, its cork beside it, 2 glasses half filled. Claire's coat hung on the hook by the door. Her boots stood neatly on the mat. The front door was locked, the deadbolt engaged. The back door's security chain was still latched. Windows sealed, no sign of forced entry. Her cell phone was on the kitchen counter, charging. Her purse with wallet and keys on the chair nearest the window. The television in the living room displayed a paused scene from a 90s sitcom marathon. The digital clock on the cable box frozen at 8:14 p.m., suggesting a power interruption. The furnace hummed steadily. The thermostat read 72 degrees. In the master bedroom, the bed was unmade, covers thrown back as though she had risen suddenly. A paperback novel lay open on the pillow, a mug of tea cooled beside it, faint lipstick on the rim. Every sign pointed to a woman who had been in the middle of an ordinary evening, until she wasn't. Officer Creighton radioed dispatch for a supervisor. By 6:30 p.m., Detective Aaron Mallory from the Carbondale Police Department stood in the entryway, studying the meticulous stillness that had already begun to feel staged. She was 46, a veteran of 2 decades investigating domestic incidents that rarely ended cleanly. She noticed the absence first, the second plate of food, the half glass of wine, the extra fork. Someone had been with Claire that night, but there was no sign of company leaving. The casserole was cooling on the stove when the technician photographed it from every angle. Its condensation had dried to streaks, suggesting hours exposed. The clock on the microwave had reset to 12:00. Consistent with a brief outage between 8 and 9 p.m., utility records later confirmed a localized surge at 8:17. Neighbors reported hearing wind, sleet against windows, a brief flicker of darkness, and then the low hum of returning power. None reported visitors, vehicles, or sounds from Claire's house. Her dog, a small terrier named Max, was missing. The absence of paw prints in the slush suggested he had gone before the rain froze. That detail would matter later. Detectives worked through the night. The forensics team dusted every surface, photographed every room. No fingerprints beyond Claire's and a partial unknown on the wine bottle that proved smudged beyond identification. No signs of struggle, no disarray, no missing valuables. The front walkway bore 2 sets of footprints, Claire's smaller size 7 boots, and another, larger set leading toward but not away from the porch. The impressions were deep, partially filled with sleet, their edges softened but intact enough to measure. A man size 11 heavy sole, possibly work boots, a common size in a county where half the population worked construction or maintenance. Inside, the refrigerator held leftovers labeled in neat handwriting, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, suggesting habitual organization. Her calendar on the wall displayed appointments in blue ink, work shifts in red. The entry for November 22nd read simply, Dinner 7 p.m. Ask about Meadowlane 2005. Investigators wouldn't understand the meaning of that note for years. They found a sealed envelope on her desk, addressed but unmailed to the county records office. Inside, a completed request form for property deeds relating to her address, dated 2 days before her disappearance. Claire's supervisor at the hospital confirmed she'd mentioned researching the history of her house, something about strange noises and a neighbor's story of previous tenants. But she'd laughed it off, saying it made her feel like she was living in a true crime documentary. Claire Donovan, 31, registered nurse, moved to Carbondale from St. Louis in April 2010 after a difficult breakup and a desire for quieter surroundings. Her co-workers described her as conscientious, introverted, precise, the kind of person who refolded hospital linens when they were slightly uneven. She had no criminal history, no known enemies, no debt. Her family, in Quincy, Illinois, told detectives she called her mother every Sunday evening without fail. The last call on November 21st ended with Claire saying she was meeting someone about the house. Her tone was upbeat. She'd said, "If I like what I hear, I might finally sleep through a night without wondering who's in the walls." At first, Detective Mallory dismissed it as a figure of speech, but the phrasing stuck with her. The investigation's first week brought little progress. Search teams combed the surrounding woods and drainage ditches. Dogs traced a scent from the back porch to the edge of a wooded lot behind Meadowlane Drive before losing it near the drainage culvert. The same culvert where, years later, evidence would resurface. For now, it yielded nothing. Surveillance canvas revealed one usable video, a neighbor's motion sensor camera that triggered at 8:19 p.m. It showed Claire's front door illuminated by a brief flash of lightning. A tall figure in a dark coat stood on the porch, back to the camera, reaching toward the doorbell. The clip ended before showing entry. When enhanced, the footage revealed a faint reflection in the storm window, a glimpse of Claire's face illuminated, looking toward the figure. Her expression unreadable. The timestamp matched the power surge. After that, nothing. No movement, no departure, no follow-up activity. The house remained still. The theory formed quickly. Claire had invited someone she knew, shared dinner, and vanished between 8:14 and 8:20. The question was why there was no sign of her leaving and no trace of a struggle inside. Investigators considered every possibility: abduction, voluntary disappearance, accident, or staged suicide. But the physical constraints argued otherwise. She hadn't left by door or window. The house's foundation vents were too small for human passage. The attic was undisturbed, the basement dry and empty except for boxes labeled in her handwriting. The only anomaly was the air vent grate in the hallway, slightly ajar, one screw missing. When technicians removed it, they found a slip of folded paper wedged between the duct and the wall. On it, written in hurried pen, "It's still here." The handwriting matched Claire's. The note's ink hadn't fully dried. Estimated written time, between 7:45 and 8:15 p.m. Lab analysis confirmed her fingerprints. The phrase sparked more confusion than clarity. Detectives speculated she'd meant an insect, a sound, a leak. But coupled with her mother's recollection about noises in the walls, the message took on ominous weight. In the following days, the media latched onto the phrase. The Meadowlane mystery became regional headline shorthand for a disappearance without exit. Volunteers distributed flyers, national outlets ran brief segments, and online forums swelled with theories: carbon monoxide hallucinations, stalker ex-boyfriend, haunted house, alien abduction. Detective Mallory ignored speculation, focusing instead on practical anomalies: the missing dog, the unmoved car, the unmailed envelope. She believed Claire had discovered something about the property's history that led her to invite someone over, someone connected to the house itself. Records indicated 2417 Meadowlane was built in 1973 on land once belonging to the defunct Meadowlane manufacturing plant, which closed in 1989 following environmental violations. Property deeds showed multiple ownership transfers through shell companies. In 2005, the house briefly stood vacant after a reported carbon monoxide leak that hospitalized previous tenants. The fire department's inspection notes mentioned structural issues beneath the flooring, but the file lacked follow-up. Claire's note about Meadowlane 2005 now pointed directly to that missing documentation. Mallory requested archived county files, but the basement where paper records were stored had flooded in 2012, destroying most property archives. Digital conversion hadn't begun until 2013. It was as if the house's paper trail had been deliberately erased. On December 1st, 9 days after the disappearance, a search volunteer found Max, the missing terrier, near the wooded culvert. The dog was alive but traumatized, whimpering when approached. Veterinary examination revealed chemical residue on its fur consistent with industrial cleaning agents. Samples were sent to the state lab. When results came back, the residue matched compounds used in sterilization processes at defunct Meadowlane Manufacturing, the same facility whose foundation lay buried beneath the subdivision. That link changed everything. Detective Mallory began to suspect that Claire's research into the property had uncovered more than old plumbing or rumors of hauntings. Environmental cleanup records hinted at unreported waste burial. But with the company dissolved and records incomplete, she was left with fragments of information and a house that seemed to reject answers. By the second week of December, the search effort scaled down. The holidays arrived and public attention shifted. Yet Mallory continued to visit 2417 Meadowlane at night, sitting in the darkened living room, listening. She heard what Claire might have meant by "it's still here," a faint rhythmic clicking from within the walls, too irregular to be pipes, too deliberate to be settling wood. She recorded it on her phone. When played back later, the sound resembled breathing. The investigation would stall for 9 years. Evidence boxes sealed, interviews archived, and Claire Donovan's name added to the state's list of long-term missing persons. But in January 2019, when renovations began on the vacant property, a construction worker's saw blade struck something metallic embedded beneath the kitchen floorboards, a sealed compartment no blueprint had ever shown. Inside lay an object that would reopen the Meadowlane case and uncover a secret buried since before the subdivision existed. The floor beneath Claire Donovan's kitchen gave way with a sound like the cracking of ice on a winter pond. On January 18, 2019, nearly 9 years after her disappearance, renovation foreman Greg Loomis had been cutting through warped linoleum when the saw blade sparked against metal. He assumed it was a pipe until the vibration shifted, hollow and echoing. When he pried back the boards, he found a steel hatch about 3 feet wide, its edges fused with corrosion, bolted to the underlying concrete. The house had been vacant since 2013, owned by a property management company that specialized in distressed sales. Greg called his supervisor, who in turn called the police when he noticed the hatch wasn't connected to any documented utilities. By 6:40 p.m., Detective Aaron Mallory, now retired but consulting part-time for the department, stood in the kitchen once again, flashlight sweeping over the same linoleum she'd paced nearly a decade earlier. The air smelled of rust and old dust, and the winter light slanted through the curtains like weak silver. A forensics team arrived with ground-penetrating radar, confirming a cavity roughly 6 feet deep beneath the hatch. When they finally unbolted it, the hinges broke with a sharp metallic crack, releasing a stale gust of air tinged with ammonia and decay. The cavity beneath was a narrow chamber lined with concrete, no larger than a bathtub, accessible only through the hatch. Inside, wrapped in plastic sheeting so brittle it disintegrated at touch, lay the remains of a small animal skeleton, later confirmed to be a dog. The tag still attached to the collar read, Max, the same terrier thought to have been found alive in 2010. Lab results would later determine that the animal recovered in 2010 had been a different dog entirely, one substituted intentionally to mislead investigators. But that revelation was months away. For now, the discovery under the floor reignited a case the department had long since filed away as unsolved. When the remains were removed, technicians noticed another object tucked beneath the plastic, a glass jar sealed with wax. Inside was a folded piece of paper, perfectly preserved. The handwriting matched Claire Donovan's. The note read, "If they find this, tell them the air isn't right." Forensic dating placed the ink's composition consistent with pens, manufactured between 2005 and 2010. Mallory stood in the kitchen long after the team left. staring at the hatch. The phrase gnawed at her. The air isn't right. She remembered Claire's complaints about noises in the walls. Sure, you're subscribed to stay updated on more cases like this. These families deserve to have their stories told, and your support helps ensure these victims are never forgotten. The half-written property request and the unmailed envelope on the desk. The environmental angle she'd once suspected resurfaced in full force. The next morning, she requested EPA soil testing around the Meadowlane subdivision. The preliminary results returned anomalies. Volatile organic compounds and traces of industrial solvents commonly used in degreasing machinery, the kind manufactured by the old Meadowlane plant. Concentrations were highest near Claire's lot. As if something below continued to off-gas, the subdivision had been built directly over the plant's waste disposal field. By the time of Claire's purchase, the records had been sanitized, the contamination reports sealed under corporate bankruptcy. Her curiosity about the property's history had brought her too close to something someone didn't want unearthed. But who, after nearly a decade, would still care enough to hide it? Detective Mallory's instincts pointed to institutional negligence rather than personal vendetta. Yet as she reopened old witness files, she found inconsistencies she hadn't seen before. Among them was a 2010 maintenance request logged with the City Utilities Department, noting a contractor inspection at 24117 Meadowlane 2 days before Claire's disappearance. The contractor listed was CR Services, a shell entity dissolved the same year. No record of the technician's identity existed. The only remaining clue was a signature, CR, scrawled on the work order. When Mallory cross-referenced the initials against city payrolls, one name stood out: Christopher Rains, a subcontracted safety inspector employed briefly during the Meadowlane subdivision's expansion. He'd left the county in early 2011, reportedly for work in Indiana. His file included a handwritten note from a 2009 complaint: unprofessional conduct toward a female homeowner. No criminal charges, no follow-up. Mallory obtained an address through DMV records. Rains, now 52, lived in Terre Haute and operated a small environmental testing company. When detectives from Illinois arrived at his office on February 3, 2019, they found him cooperative but visibly nervous. He claimed he remembered Claire Donovan only vaguely, one of many inspections that week. He denied entering her home, insisting he'd just done an exterior assessment for foundation moisture. But when asked to provide documentation, he hesitated. Investigators later discovered that the original inspection forms for November 2010 were missing from county archives, just like the property deed Claire had tried to obtain. The deeper they dug, the more records vanished. Mallory began to suspect a deliberate pattern, a chain of erasures extending back to 2005, the year of the supposed carbon monoxide incident. The fire department's old reports mentioned a leak from subfloor venting. Anomaly. What if that vent anomaly had been connected not to carbon monoxide but to off-gassing industrial chemicals seeping from the buried waste? Claire's note about the air wasn't metaphorical, it was literal. She'd discovered toxic vapors beneath her home. But how did that connect to her disappearance? The answer emerged through laboratory reanalysis of preserved dust samples from 2010. When the State Forensic Lab tested the residue from Claire's air vents, stored since her disappearance, they detected traces of chlorinated solvents, specifically trichloroethylene, a known carcinogen once used at the Meadowlane plant. Prolonged exposure could cause neurological symptoms, dizziness, disorientation, even hallucinations. Claire might have experienced confusion or paranoia before her disappearance. Yet that still didn't explain the footprints, the missing hours, or the note written in full clarity. Mallory believed she had been lucid, aware of danger, perhaps confronting someone responsible. On February 15, 2019, police obtained a warrant to excavate beneath the property. Heavy machinery tore through frost and clay until, at 4 feet deep, they struck a corroded pipe network branching outward like veins. Inside the pipes was a viscous residue of chemical sludge. Among the debris, they found something else: a plastic ID badge bearing the faded logo of Meadowlane Manufacturing and a name: Christopher Rains, Safety Division. The discovery connected Rains directly to the original contamination and placed him at the center of the cover-up. He had been part of the cleanup crew that buried hazardous waste instead of disposing of it legally. The theory formed quickly. Rains had revisited the property in 2010 after Claire's inquiries threatened exposure, but proving it required more than circumstantial evidence. When confronted with the badge, Rains insisted it must have been planted, that he'd lost his old credentials years earlier. But his tone shifted when detectives mentioned the dog remains. He leaned back, eyes narrowing, and asked if they'd found the other part yet. The interview paused. When asked to clarify, he said only, "You'll smell it before you see it." 3 days later, the excavation team did. 26 feet east of the foundation, buried in a concrete drainage vault connected to the old plant infrastructure, cadaver dogs alerted. Excavation revealed a sealed industrial drum, its serial number matching records from 1988 chemical storage manifests. Inside, wrapped in decomposed plastic, were human remains later confirmed by dental records and mitochondrial DNA to be Claire Donovan. Her body had been encased in polymerized sludge, preserved almost mummified. The positioning suggested she'd been placed deliberately, not dumped, hands folded, head tilted. The forensic pathologist could not determine exact cause of death due to chemical degradation, but microscopic analysis of lung tissue preserved in the matrix showed evidence of inhaled solvents consistent with trichloroethylene poisoning. Claire hadn't been murdered by weapon or force. She had suffocated in her own home, poisoned by air she tried to warn about. The killer hadn't needed to touch her, only to seal the truth beneath concrete. The case should have ended there, but questions lingered. Why the staged dinner, the footprints, the second dog? And how had her body traveled from beneath the kitchen to a buried vault 26 feet away? Construction records provided part of the answer. During subdivision expansion in 2012, a private crew had replaced sewer lines near Meadowlane Drive. The foreman, paid through a dissolved LLC, was, again, Christopher Rains. The excavation likely disturbed the sealed hatch, allowing Rains to relocate the remains to a deeper vault before resale of the house, ensuring the contamination stayed hidden. The deception was nearly perfect until a contractor's saw exposed the hatch's edge in 2019. When confronted with this timeline, Rains broke. His confession came in fragments over 3 days of interrogation, each word soaked with resignation. He claimed Claire had contacted him after discovering inconsistencies in her property paperwork. She'd noticed strange readings on her home carbon monoxide detector and asked him, as the listed safety inspector, to recheck the foundation. He arrived at 7 p.m. on November 22nd. They ate dinner. She'd cooked casserole, opened wine. When she confronted him with evidence of buried waste, he panicked. He admitted sealing the hatch years earlier after dumping residual chemicals into a subfloor containment chamber, unaware anyone would live above it. He said the vapors must have been leaking again, and that Claire began coughing violently during their argument. He insisted she collapsed on her own, claiming he tried to help but feared calling for aid would expose everything. So he contained the scene, his words. He wrapped her in plastic, lowered her through the hatch into the chamber, sealed it, then forged her signature on the missing inspection forms to imply closure. When the neighborhood later complained about odors, he conducted fake remediation and eventually buried her remains deeper during the 2012 infrastructure update. He replaced her missing dog with another to deflect attention, taking advantage of its similar breed and coloring. His actions were not driven by malice, he said, but by fear. Fear of prison, lawsuits, ruin. His company, his reputation, his entire career built on silence. He'd told himself she was already dead, that burying her protected everyone. In court, the defense argued manslaughter under panic and industrial negligence. The prosecution called it calculated concealment. The jury needed only 2 hours. On October 23, 2020, Christopher Rains was convicted of second-degree murder and unlawful disposal of hazardous materials. The Meadowlane subdivision was evacuated 6 months later for environmental remediation. 27 additional homes tested positive for contamination. Claire Donovan's mother, Ellen, attended every day of the trial, seated in the front row, a locket containing her daughter's photo clutched in her hand. She spoke at sentencing, her voice steady as she said, "She warned you. You poisoned her for telling the truth." Rains was sentenced to 38 years in state prison. The Meadowlane property was demolished in early 2021. Beneath the rubble, crews discovered a final sealed vent. Inside was a single slip of paper, degraded but legible. It's gone quiet now. Handwriting analysts confirmed it was Claire's. The note had been written after her supposed time of death, the ink drawn in the same hurried pen as her earlier message. Investigators never explained how. Some speculated the chemical reactions preserved residual impressions that continued forming lines over time. Others believed she'd regained consciousness after Rains sealed the hatch, writing in her final moments before the air turned toxic. Detective Mallory, now fully retired, visited the site one last time. The subdivision was gone, replaced by an empty field fenced with warning signs. She stood at the place where the kitchen had been, listening to the winter wind move through the grass. It sounded almost like breathing. When the verdict came down in October 2020, the courtroom was silent except for the soft hum of the ceiling fans. Reporters filled the benches, their cameras momentarily forgotten as they stared at the man who had kept an entire town poisoned in silence. Christopher Rains didn't react when the judge read the sentence. He simply lowered his head, as though listening to something only he could hear. Detective Mallory watched from the gallery, her face unreadable, the years etched deep around her eyes. For her, the conviction brought no satisfaction, only a quiet exhaustion that settled into her bones. The case had consumed a decade of her life, and though the truth had surfaced, it came too late for Claire Donovan, too late for the hundreds of residents unknowingly breathing toxic air. The Meadowlane subdivision was evacuated within months, its residents relocated as state and federal agencies descended on Carbondale. EPA teams in white hazmat suits moved in like ghosts, sealing driveways with plastic, drilling boreholes into lawns, extracting samples that smoked faintly in the cold. The once proud community of starter homes became a ghost development, its for sale signs flapping aimlessly in the winter wind. By spring 2021, the entire area was fenced off, the houses bulldozed to their foundations. The remediation crews called it the Quiet Zone. No one argued the name. But even after the demolition, something lingered. In May 2021, contractors digging near the former Meadowlane drainage culvert uncovered another sealed drum identical to the one that had held Claire's body. This one contained nothing human, only rusted tools, glass vials, and paper logs soaked into pulp. Yet among the debris was a single intact item, a cassette tape labeled Air Tests 2417. The handwriting was neat, slanted, identical to Claire's. Forensic analysts restored the tape over several days. Coaxing sound from its oxidized ribbon. What emerged was faint but distinct. A woman's voice, calm and methodical, describing test readings. Day 3, baseline levels constant. No odor today, but the clicking persists in the walls. I think something is moving through the vents. It stops when I record. Then a pause, the faint hum of static, followed by a whisper so close to the microphone it distorted. It's still here. The timestamp on the recording placed it at 9:12 p.m. on November 22, 2010, almost an hour after investigators believed Claire was already dead. The discovery forced the state lab to re-examine everything. The tape's authenticity was confirmed, genuine analog degradation, consistent with being buried for nearly a decade. But how had Claire's voice been recorded after her estimated time of death? Theories spread quickly. Some suggested she had survived longer than Rains claimed, trapped beneath the hatch, recording in darkness as the chemicals seeped through. Others believed the timestamp mechanism had malfunctioned under exposure. Mallory listened to the tape alone in her kitchen long after midnight. She recognized the steadiness in Claire's voice, not panic, not confusion, but observation. The same calm precision that nurses use during crisis. She was documenting her own death. The tape reignited public obsession. True crime podcasts dissected every second. Amateur investigators built 3D models of the house from old blueprints, and online forums swarmed with speculation. Some claimed Rains wasn't acting alone, that others in the original cleanup crew had orchestrated a cover-up stretching beyond one man's fear. The most persistent theory centered on the missing years of environmental records between 1989 and 1993, the gap before the subdivision's development. Mallory initially ignored the noise, but one comment on a forum caught her eye. It came from a user calling themselves MB1974, claiming to have worked at the Meadowlane plant before its closure. The post read, "We were told to pour it under the west wing. Said it would stabilize the soil. No one told us people would live there." The IP traced back to Marion, Illinois, 40 miles south. Mallory contacted local police, who identified the user as Martin Bell, 71, a former maintenance worker at the plant. He agreed to speak on record. When she arrived at his home, Bell was frail, oxygen tube hissing softly beside him. His hands trembled as he pointed toward a dusty file box under his coffee table. Hit the like button if you believe cold cases deserve more attention. Inside were old pay stubs, safety reports, and a set of photographs showing the Meadowlane plant's West Wing excavation circa 1989. The images revealed open trenches filled with sealed barrels identical to those later recovered. Hundreds of them. But one photo showed something different, a section of concrete tunnel running beneath the waste pits, labeled Air Exchange Corridor. Bell explained that the tunnels had been part of a ventilation experiment designed to vent industrial gases away from the factory floor. When the plant shut down, management ordered the tunnels sealed. But we didn't seal them all, Bell said, his voice rasping. Some ran all the way to the subdivision line. They called it the crawl space, said it was harmless. If Bell was right, then beneath Meadowlane existed an entire network of forgotten ducts capable of carrying both fumes and sound. The clicking Claire had heard in her walls might not have been hallucination. It could have been echoes from those sealed passages, shifting as pressure built. Mallory took the photos to the EPA command center. Engineers confirmed the layout matched ground radar anomalies detected during cleanup, hollow voids stretching beneath multiple lots. The realization meant that the contamination was far more extensive than previously thought. It also meant that when Raines claimed he'd buried Claire's body under the kitchen, he might not have been lying entirely. The tunnel system could have connected the chamber beneath her floor to the deeper vault where her remains were later found, allowing gas pressure or even Raines himself to move her remains during subsequent excavations. But one question persisted. Why had Raines said, "You'll smell it before you see it"? What exactly had he meant by it? The forensic reconstruction of the tape provided a partial answer. During the final seconds before static overtook the recording, a faint rhythmic sound emerged behind Claire's voice. When amplified, it resembled breathing, not mechanical, not wind, but organic, steady, and close. The lab dismissed it as interference from the recorder's motor. Mallory wasn't convinced. The chemical fumes had been dense enough to create echo artifacts. The human brain often imposed pattern on chaos, but something in her gut told her Claire had been right about more than toxins. That intuition hardened when she received a call from the Illinois Department of Corrections in August 2021. Christopher Raines was dead. Found in his cell, alone, cause of death listed as respiratory failure. The guard who discovered him reported hearing a faint mechanical clicking from inside the vent above his bunk moments before he collapsed. The autopsy revealed traces of the same chlorinated solvent found in Claire's tissue samples, somehow present in the prison's recirculated air, despite no external contamination. The event was ruled accidental, but Mallory knew better. Someone or something had reawakened what Claire called the air. In October 2021, as remediation continued, engineers attempting to seal the last of the tunnels beneath Meadowlane's remains encountered an impassable section filled with dense chemical fog. Their ventilation equipment malfunctioned. Sensors recorded inexplicable electrical interference. The crew reported hearing faint voices through their respirators, one distinctly female, repeating the words, "It's still here." The foreman shut down the operation. The area was resealed under emergency orders. Officially, the report cited equipment malfunction due to vapor interference. Unofficially, the crew refused to return. Mallory visited the site one final time before the EPA closed it permanently. She walked the perimeter fence under gray autumn sky, her breath fogging in the chill. Beyond the barrier, the ground rippled slightly where the tunnels lay collapsing under their own weight. She placed her hand on the cold metal mesh and whispered Claire's name. For a moment the wind died completely, and in the silence that followed, she thought she heard the faintest echo from beneath the earth, a slow, deliberate click, followed by a sigh. That night she wrote her final report. It contained no mention of ghosts or curses, only the facts. Claire Donovan discovered illegal toxic waste beneath her home, was silenced by the man responsible, and in dying exposed the system that allowed it. But the last line she typed, one she never sent to the official file, read, "Whatever was released there, it's not finished." In 2022, the state redeveloped the area into a nature preserve. No homes, no playgrounds, only tall grass and warning signs reading, "Soil disturbance prohibited." Visitors reported the air carried a faint chemical sweetness, like disinfectant mixed with something floral. On still days, the grass flattened in rhythmic pulses, as though exhaling. A local journalist who visited the site for an anniversary feature noticed a new memorial plaque near the fence. It bore no sponsor's name, just a simple inscription. "She tried to tell us." When the journalist checked later, the plaque was gone. Only the mounting bolts remained, edges rusted, smelling faintly of bleach. In her retirement, Detective Mallory kept the cassette tape locked in a drawer. Sometimes, when the insomnia returned, she played it again, the hiss and crackle filling her quiet apartment. Each time, she swore the tape had changed slightly, the pauses longer, the breathing closer, the whisper at the end clearer. "It's not gone." She stopped listening after that. The Meadowlane file was officially closed in December 2022, but rumors persisted among EPA contractors that new gas readings still fluctuated around the sealed tunnels, spikes that came and went without environmental cause. The data always registered at night between 8 and 9 p.m., the same hour Claire disappeared 12 years earlier. By the spring of 2023, the story of Meadowlane had drifted from the headlines into the gray space between legend and bureaucratic memory. The EPA's final remediation report classified the area as non-habitable for indefinite duration, a technical phrase meaning forever. Federal funding dried up, the fences remained, the signs stayed, and Carbondale's city planners quietly redrew maps so the subdivision no longer appeared by name. But data didn't disappear as easily as houses did. A graduate student from the University of Illinois conducting independent atmospheric studies noticed something impossible. Her field sensors left overnight near the old Meadowlane site recorded a pattern of volatile organic compound spikes that rose and fell every 58 seconds, an oscillation too regular to be random. The compounds matched the trichloroethylene signature linked to the 2010 poisoning, but the concentration levels fluctuated in sync with barometric pressure, like breath. The student, named Amanda Greer, posted her findings to an academic forum. Within days, the thread was flooded with speculation. Some called it residual chemical burping, an artifact of decaying waste pockets. Others joked that the land itself was exhaling. The post might have died there, but one of the replies came from an unverified account under the handle CR Experiment. It read, "It's not breathing. It's remembering." The IP traced back to a state government network in Springfield. When the EPA's digital security team investigated, they found no record of such a user, no login, no trace of the comment in the system logs. The message existed for 12 minutes before vanishing entirely. That same week, the Illinois Department of Public Health reported 3 cases of unexplained respiratory illness among workers involved in sealing the Meadowlane tunnels. The symptoms were identical to those described in early Meadowlane contamination victims: chemical burns to the lungs, dizziness, auditory hallucinations. One worker claimed he'd heard a woman's voice inside his respirator mask saying, "You sealed it wrong." Another swore he'd seen handprints forming on the interior of his face shield. The department suspended further remediation. Unofficially, they wanted the site forgotten again. Detective Erin Mallory, though officially retired, still received occasional calls from former colleagues whenever a new Meadowlane oddity surfaced. When she heard about the worker incidents, she drove to Carbondale, parking by the same chain-link fence she'd stood beside 2 years earlier. Beyond it, the field had grown over with tall, pale weeds. The air shimmered faintly, like heat rising from asphalt. She stood watching for nearly an hour before noticing a pattern. The weeds moved, not with the wind, but in synchronized ripples running parallel to the old drainage culvert. Something beneath the ground was still shifting. Mallory left the site uneasy but not afraid. Fear had long since dulled into grim curiosity. That night she met with Amanda Greer at a diner outside town. The young researcher brought printouts of her data, columns of numbers overlaid on atmospheric maps. When Mallory compared them to old property records, she saw the peaks of the chemical oscillations aligned perfectly with the original Meadowlane house foundations. Every 48 to 60 seconds, the readings pulsed across the grid, following the old street plan as though the ghost of the neighborhood still existed under the soil. Amanda asked if the data could be electromagnetic interference. Mallory shook her head. "It's trying to repeat itself," she said quietly. The words weren't scientific, but they felt true. 2 weeks later, the Carbondale Police Department received a 911 call from a local salvage crew working on the southern edge of the fenced zone. The caller's voice was panicked, distorted by static. "We found a room down here. It's not on the map. There's stuff written all over the walls." The line cut out mid-sentence. When officers arrived, they found the crew's truck idling at the roadside, headlights on, doors open. 3 workers were missing. Inside the excavation pit, a broken section of tunnel wall revealed a sealed chamber. Its interior was lined with concrete panels carved with hundreds of phrases etched by hand into the surface. The writing was erratic, layered over itself like a palimpsest. Most of the sentences repeated variations of one line, "It's still here." Others read, "The air remembers, and we built over the wrong vein." Laboratory dating later showed the etchings had been made years before 2010, likely during the original plant closure. The chamber appeared to have served as an experimental observation room connected to the plant's air exchange system. Residue analysis confirmed the presence of the same solvent vapors found in Claire Donovan's lungs, though at higher concentrations. The 3 missing workers were never recovered. Surveillance footage from the excavation site showed them descending into the pit, their headlamps flickering as they entered the chamber. A few seconds later, the feed went dark. When power returned, the chamber stood empty, dust undisturbed, no footprints leading out. The official report blamed structural collapse and suffocation, but no bodies were found in the debris. Mallory, brought in as a consultant once again, reviewed the footage frame by frame. Just before the blackout, one of the workers turned toward the camera, his face partially obscured by the glare of his lamp. Reflected in his visor was another face, a woman's, pale and indistinct, standing directly behind him. The timestamp read 8:17 p.m., the same time power had surged through Claire Donovan's house 13 years earlier. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. Mallory felt the chill of something that wasn't entirely rational creeping back into her life. She began visiting the archives, rereading every witness statement from 2010. In one early report she had almost forgotten, Claire's neighbor, Harold Bixby, mentioned something strange. Sometimes when the wind came from the west, you could smell something sweet like flowers, and hear knocking from under the floor, always 3 knocks, never more. The original transcript had misprinted knocking as knocking pipe, making it seem mechanical. But now, reading the corrected copy, Mallory felt the detail slot perfectly into place. 3 knocks. 3 missing workers. 3 decades of silence broken in cycles. When she traced the old ventilation schematics from the Meadowlane plant, she realized the buried tunnels converged beneath one point, the center of what had been 2417, Meadowlane Drive. The blueprints labeled the intersection Exchange Core. Engineers had designed it to regulate pressure between underground ducts, using temperature differentials to move air. But the system had never been decommissioned properly. The core still existed, buried under layers of contaminated soil. Mallory proposed sealing it with concrete, but the EPA declined. The pressure readings were unstable, they said, and sealing could trigger a collapse. That night, unable to sleep, Mallory returned to the fence and watched the ground until the moon rose. Around 8:20 p.m., she saw the soil near the former house pulse outward in slow, rhythmic bursts, releasing faint wisps of vapor that caught the moonlight like breath. Each pulse lasted exactly 58 seconds. In her car afterward, her recorder captured her own voice whispering, "It's still breathing." In July 2023, an investigative journalist named David Rowan began producing a documentary about the Meadowlane case. He interviewed Mallory, the EPA engineers, and surviving residents. During editing, Rowan's audio technician noticed something buried under the dialogue, a faint whisper repeating through every clip recorded near the site, regardless of equipment or microphone type. The words were always the same. "The air isn't right." Rowan included the phenomenon in his final cut. When the documentary premiered on an online streaming platform that autumn, it reached over 4 million views in 2 weeks. Public reaction reignited the case nationally, and state officials, desperate to reassure the public, authorized a final exploratory survey of the Meadowlane tunnels using remote drones. The first drone entered the main corridor on October 14, 2023. For the first 300 feet, the footage showed rusted steel beams, collapsed concrete, and stagnant water. Then, as the drone descended toward the exchange core, interference filled the feed. High-pitched feedback followed by an image that froze halfway through a frame. For exactly 47 seconds, the transmission displayed what appeared to be a room identical to Claire Donovan's kitchen. Pristine, untouched, bathed in yellow light. 2 plates on the table. A bottle of wine. The image vanished, replaced by static. The drone was later recovered 50 feet from the core, its memory card intact but data corrupted. Engineers insisted the kitchen scene must have been a cached image from an old television signal, somehow re-recorded through frequency overlap. But Mallory knew there was no broadcast capable of replicating that angle. The image had been captured from inside the room, as though the house still existed beneath the soil, replaying its final moments again and again. After that, the EPA sealed the site permanently, filling the tunnels with concrete foam. The oscillations ceased. The air tests flattened to baseline. For the first time in 13 years, Meadowlane was truly silent. Or so it seemed. On December 22, 2023, 2 nights before Christmas, Mallory received a package without return address. Inside was a single USB drive. The label read, "From the core." Against her better judgment, she plugged it into her laptop. The screen flickered, loading a folder containing one file, an audio recording time-stamped November 22, 2010, 8:19 p.m. It began with static, then the familiar hum of Claire's cassette tape, followed by a new voice. Faint but unmistakable. "It's gone quiet now. You finished what I couldn't." Then silence. Mallory sat frozen, staring at the clock on her desk. It read 8:19 p.m. exactly. The voice on the USB haunted Erin Mallory long after it ended. She listened to it over and over, noting how the background hum matched the same low frequency recorded in Claire Donovan's original cassette. The resonance wasn't electrical. It was environmental, a vibration around 18 hertz, barely audible, the kind associated with the tremors of underground pressure systems. Yet, when she ran a spectrum analysis, the waveform formed a perfect repetition of Claire's final recorded breathing pattern. The same frequency, the same tempo, like an echo continuing long after the source had gone silent. Mallory filed a private request to trace the origin of the USB package through postal metadata, but the file returned empty. No sender, no postage record, no scan entries. The package had appeared at the sorting center without origin. That night she dreamed of the Meadowlane house as it had been, light still burning in the kitchen, the casserole warm on the stove, 2 plates waiting. She woke gasping, the taste of chemical sweetness on her tongue. By January 2024, she had begun to write a book about the case. Not a true crime account, but something quieter, a personal record, fragments of memory stitched with official reports. She titled it, "The Air Isn't Right." Yet every time she tried to write about Claire, her computer froze precisely at 8:19 p.m., the cursor blinking until the power reset. Her publisher assumed a software glitch. Mallory stopped arguing. She printed drafts on a typewriter instead. Meanwhile, beneath the official silence, whispers continued. Construction companies bidding on state contracts in southern Illinois reported being required to sign non-disclosure agreements referencing Meadowlane parameters, even when their work sites were miles away. One leak from a subcontractor revealed internal memos describing deep subsurface anomalies detected by seismographs under Carbondale, patterns consistent with hollow movement far below the sealed zone. When the memo surfaced online, it was deleted within hours. Mallory's curiosity, long dormant, reignited. She reached out to Amanda Greer, the student whose sensors had first recorded the oscillations. Amanda, now a research fellow, had continued her studies in secret, using weather balloons to sample air composition above the restricted zone. Her latest data showed something astonishing. Trace elements of polymerized organic material suspended in the atmosphere, forming microfilaments unlike any known aerosol. Under microscope, the filaments twisted and contracted in response to temperature changes, as if breathing. Amanda compared the pattern to self-organizing chemical memory. Mallory remembered Claire's final message, "The air isn't right," and realized maybe it had never been about poison. Maybe the contamination wasn't killing. Maybe it was recording. In February 2024, a winter storm struck southern Illinois, tearing down sections of the Meadowlane fence. Locals reported seeing faint lights under the snow, spreading in slow pulses. The city cordoned off the area again, but by then several scavengers had entered the site. One of them, a man named Peter Lyle, posted a short video before his account disappeared. The footage, shaky and grainy, showed him walking through the field at dusk, his breath fogging in the cold. The camera tilted toward the ground, where small cracks glowed faintly beneath the frost, tracing the old outline of Meadowlane Drive. As he walked, the air shimmered, and a voice whispered faintly through the wind, "Come back inside." The video ended abruptly. Lyle was never found. The media dismissed it as hoax, but Mallory couldn't ignore the detail. The same phrase neighbors had heard during the power flicker in 2010, reported in a forgotten note buried in the old case file. She began compiling every account of auditory hallucinations linked to the site: workers, journalists, residents, even Rains before his death. All described the same cadence, the same low whisper, as if spoken through the house vents. The words varied slightly. Sometimes "it's still here," sometimes "come back inside," sometimes just her name, Claire. The one common element: all reports occurred at 8:19 p.m. on March 3, 2024. Mallory received another unmarked envelope. Inside was a black and white photograph of a group of construction workers standing in front of a sign reading, "Meadowlane Manufacturing, Air Systems Division, 1988. Among them was a young man, unmistakably Christopher Rains, smiling, one arm slung around another worker's shoulders. But it wasn't Rains that chilled her. It was the woman standing at the far edge of the group, half in shadow. She looked exactly like Claire Donovan. Same build, same profile. Even the same necklace Claire's mother had identified in photos from 2010. Yet the photograph was dated 22 years before Claire was born. Forensic analysis confirmed the print and ink were consistent with materials from the late 1980s. The negative did not exist in any archive. When Mallory showed it to Amanda, the young woman suggested something extraordinary. Perhaps the contamination had preserved not just chemicals, but imprints, records of people who lived and died within its radius, memories stored in molecular residue, occasionally surfacing in physical form, a chemical memory field. If that was true, Meadowlane was more than a crime scene. It was an archive of the dead. Driven by both dread and duty, Mallory contacted the University of Illinois Geology Department, requesting deep seismic mapping under the former site. The scans revealed a circular cavity roughly 80 feet below the surface, 10 meters wide, resonating with low-frequency vibrations. The shape wasn't natural. It resembled an artificial dome, smooth and symmetrical. When probed with acoustic pulses, the structure reflected sound waves irregularly, as if hollow but filled with semi-solid material. Mallory asked the lead geologist what it could be. He hesitated before saying, "If it's not a void, it might be something like a bubble, pressurized, maybe biological." The term biological lodged in her mind like a splinter. Within weeks, state authorities shut down the investigation, citing unacceptable structural risk. The geologist's report was sealed. He resigned 2 days later. In April, Amanda vanished. She'd told Mallory she planned to conduct one last test near the Meadowlane fence, attaching sensors to capture atmospheric resonance during the nightly oscillations. Her last text to Mallory read, 8:19 tonight. If it happens again, we'll know it's conscious. She never sent another message. Her car was found parked near the restricted gate, engine cold, driver's door open, passenger seat dusted with white crystalline residue. Laboratory testing identified the substance as polymerized solvent similar to the aerosols Amanda had studied. It shimmered faintly under UV light, forming filaments that twisted toward warmth. The news broke quietly. Missing researcher last seen near Carbondale contamination site. No follow-up coverage. No public outrage. People were tired of Meadowlane. Mallory, alone again, returned to the site. She parked by the fence at dusk, watching as fog gathered over the ground like breath. At exactly 8:19, her car radio turned on by itself, the dial spinning to a dead frequency. Through static came the same hum as the USB file. Then a voice, fainter yet unmistakable. "Aaron!" She froze, hand gripping the steering wheel. The voice repeated, softer. "It's not finished." She switched the ignition, drove away trembling. That night, she wrote her resignation letter to the state consulting board. But she didn't send it. Instead, she began transcribing every sound, every incident, every 8:19 disturbance she could find. Over months, she filled 3 notebooks, pages dense with coordinates and times. When she overlaid the data points on a regional map, The pattern formed a perfect spiral centered on the Meadowlane core. Each disturbance radiated outward, week by week, as if something beneath was expanding, inhaling more deeply each time. By August 2024, nearby towns began reporting unexplained sinkholes emitting faint chemical odors. In some, residents heard rhythmic knocking before the collapse. Environmental sensors picked up brief bursts of trichloroethylene gas followed by silence. Local papers dubbed them breathing pits. State officials denied any connection to Meadowlane. But the spiral on Mallory's map matched the sinkholes exactly. Whatever had started under 2417, Meadowlane was spreading outward in pulses. The last entry in her notebook, dated September 12, 2024, read, "Each breath longer than the last." 2 days later, the same low-frequency tremor registered across 5 counties. The event lasted 47 seconds, the precise length of the corrupted drone footage from 2023. Satellite thermal imaging showed a transient heat bloom under the old Meadowlane site. Circular, expanding, then vanishing. No seismic damage, no radiation. Just movement, deep and deliberate, as if something large had turned in its sleep. Afterward, the oscillations ceased completely. Air tests returned clean. The wind smelled only of soil and autumn. The state declared the zone stable and lifted restrictions in November. Developers began proposing a memorial park on the land. Life resumed. But on the evening of November 22nd, the 13th anniversary of Claire Donovan's disappearance, residents in neighboring counties reported a faint electrical flicker around 8:19 p.m. For exactly 1 minute, streetlights dimmed, televisions froze on static, and every weather station in southern Illinois recorded a single, synchronized pressure drop, as if the entire region had exhaled. Mallory, sitting alone in her apartment, watched her lamp pulse once, twice, then steady. She didn't move. She just listened. In the quiet, she thought she heard Claire's voice, not whispering this time, but calm, steady, almost relieved. It's quiet now. The quiet held through winter. A taut stillness stretched over Carbondale like a sheet of glass. By January 2025, the field where Meadowlane once stood had grown a rough stubble of winter rye, a stabilization cover seeded by contractors before the frost. The fence remained, not so much a barrier as a reminder that boundaries once drawn can outlive the reasons they were needed. Detective Erin Mallory, retired, unwilling to be done, visited as she did on the anniversaries, parking beneath the skeletal cottonwood at the corner where an address had once meant a home. She listened for the old rhythm, the 58-second pulse, the subterranean breath. It did not come. When the wind shifted, she smelled only clean, cold, and distant wood smoke, none of the sweet antiseptic note that had haunted a decade of nights. It should have comforted her, but it didn't. Absence is not the same as peace. She kept thinking of Claire Donovan's last verifiable words, the line written and sealed in wax. If they find this, tell them the air isn't right. The warning had been precise, clinical, not mystical. The air carried memory, carried harm, carried a pattern of repetition strong enough to replay a life's final hour across years. Now that pattern had gone silent, as if a metronome had wound down. Something within Erin resisted the notion that silence equaled safety. Systems don't cease. They conclude. Conclusions have signatures. She went looking for one. The search began not in the field, but in paper, the last refuge of a world that wanted forgetting. Over 2 weeks, she read minutes from council meetings, contractor invoices, EPA memos with half the lines blacked out, and a battered 3-ring binder she'd overlooked for years because its tab was misfiled under waste. MISC. Inside were photocopied handouts from the Meadowlane plant's Air Systems Division, bullet points in 12-point font describing the rationale for an exchange core that would balance pressure between subfloor cavities and corridor ducts. One line was underlined twice. Memory effect of solvent-rich air remains unquantified. Anecdotal reports of acoustic retention under static load require further study. She checked the date on the memo, September 1988, and wrote it down beside a name in the footer. Dr. Leon Karsh, atmospheric engineer. A search of state licensure records turned up nothing recent. A search of retirement databases found a Karsh in a nursing facility 3 counties north, 93 years old, and listed as nonverbal. People find ways to talk when the subject refuses to let them go. She drove up on a gray Tuesday, brought a soft-bound notebook and the patience of someone who had sat through decades of silence and learned to recognize an opening. Karsh's room was warm and dim, the hum of oxygen a low, steady presence. His eyes were clouded by cataracts but tracked her. Erin introduced herself. A police badge she no longer carried held like an old photograph, something that conferred shape. She said the word Meadowlane and the old man's hand spasmed, fingers flinching as if remembering the heat of metal. When she told him Claire's name, he took a breath that seemed to come from the soles of his feet, then let it out in a tremor that rattled the oxygen line. He couldn't speak, but his wall held a corkboard mapped with pushpins and threads. His son, called from work and standing awkwardly in the doorway, explained. His father had pinned things he couldn't say. Colors meant categories, threads marked progression. Red for accidents, blue for airflow, green for people. Erin watched the old man's hand lift, shake, and point to a cluster of blue pins around a photocopied blueprint labeled Exchange Core, Revision B. A green thread crossed it, drawn toward a Polaroid thumbtacked askew, bleached by sun to the edge of legibility. The image showed a small concrete room lined with panels and a vent aperture like a mouth. On the back, someone had written 3 knocks confirm resonance. Erin asked for permission to photograph the board, to scan the documents, to copy anything that might tell her the shape of the silence they had purchased with concrete and breath. Karsh's son nodded, a man who had lived with unsaid things and recognized when a weight might be moved. Back in her apartment, Erin laid the images on the floor, taped together a composite of the exchange core like a jigsaw done without the picture on the box. The pattern that emerged was gruesomely elegant. Air channels designed to carry fumes away from factory floors had been rerouted during shutdown to diffuse pressure in the soil, to bleed out pockets of vapor before they could explode. But in creating a network to move memory-rich solvent through confined spaces, the engineers had built an instrument, unintended, unrecognized, that could hold echoes the way a bell holds tone. The memory was not superstition. It was physics. The signature would not be a voice or a flicker. It would be the collapse of an echo. Silence as artifact. She needed measurement. She called Amanda Greer's advisor, a careful woman with a careful voice, and an inbox filled by requests the university could not sanction. Off the record, the advisor shared a backup Amanda had left on a lab server, the last model she'd run before she disappeared. It simulated an aerosolized polymer chain, forming from chlorinated solvent interacting with humidity and dust, a lattice capable of aligning under low-frequency vibration. The model predicted a decay once external forcing ceased. The lattice would relax, its stored acoustic pattern bleeding out as low heat. The predicted duration of the final bleed matched the weeks after the state filled the tunnels. Erin read the last line of Amanda's notes, typed at 3 in the morning in a graduate student's fighting font. If the field stops pulsing, the memories will finish playing and then dissolve. The end is not a boom. It's a fade. She drove to the fence at dusk and waited for 8:19. The glass of her driver's side window held her reflection and the field beyond, 2 panes layered into one. When the minute turned, nothing happened. No hiss through the vents that were no longer there, no pulse, no breath. But in the silence, the air felt warmer by a fraction. A skin temperature rise like someone standing too close. Then, so soft she thought she was imagining it, a single knock from somewhere under the earth. Not 3, 1. The old signatures were gone. Something new had taken their place. She turned on the recorder she'd promised herself she would stop using. The one that contained 57 hours of hiss and 2 seconds of words that kept her awake. She let it run until the battery died, then took it home and listened with the volume low and the lights off. The waveform was flat until the last minute. Then a shape, not breath, not whisper. A tremor, long and even, occupying the frequency where the old hum had lived, but thinner, more human, as if a throat had been cleared after a long sleep. The next day, a letter arrived, forwarded by the department from an address that did not exist. It contained a photocopy of a death certificate from 1991, Meadowlane manufacturing employee, Air Systems Division, accidental exposure, name redacted. A handwritten note at the bottom said, "We buried the first in concrete because we did not know better. The second carried warning in her lungs because we did not listen. The third you owe to memory." No signature. Erin traced the paper with her finger, the way she had traced blueprints, the way she had traced the outline of a casserole dish in her mind until she could see the condensation beads as clearly as if she were still standing in that kitchen. She made one more call to Ellen Donovan. The line rang twice before the voice answered, a little older, a little more breath between words, but steady. Erin told her about the field, about the quiet, about a science that had taken something away and given something back that was not enough and yet was all that there was to give. She did not say closure. She said conclusion. Ellen asked if the ground still breathed. Erin said no, and the silence they shared for a long moment wasn't grief but something adjacent to it, an acceptance that did not require forgiveness. Ellen said she wanted to stand where her daughter's kitchen had been. Erin picked a day without wind. They met at the fence at noon, and because most rules are made to be understood rather than obeyed when they fail to serve the living, Erin opened the service gate and led her across the frozen ruts into the field. She stopped when her steps told her the distance was right, when she could feel the rectangle of the old room in the way the air held itself. Ellen closed her eyes, turned once slowly, and smiled the smallest possible smile, like the end of a song that had held on one last note and finally let it go. She said thank you to no one in particular. They left the way they came, with nothing in their hands and something unnameable a little lighter in their chests. That night, Erin sat at her kitchen table and opened the typewriter case, fed a sheet of paper, and began with the sentence that had eluded her for a year. The air remembers until it doesn't. And then it makes room. She wrote straight through to midnight, stopping only once at 8:19 to listen to the room hold its own breath and release it harmlessly into the dark. In the spring, the city council voted to designate the land a conservation easement. No memorial stones, no playground plaques, just native prairie and a single line on the official map that said restored soil. Erin visited one last time before the grasses rose above her knees. She stood where the kitchen had been and pictured the paused sitcom, the wine in the glass, the second plate set with the gratuity of hospitality that is one of the last things we lose when we lose other things. She pictured the note in the vent and the preserved hand. She pictured the man who had sealed a hatch because fear taught him to call concealment a solution. And she pictured the engineer who drew the line that made a bell of the ground because no one had yet told him how long a solvent could hold a name. She spoke Claire's name into the air, and then she spoke Amanda's. The wind did the rest. In April, the university posted a final addendum to the Meadowlane atmospheric study, unsigned but clearly Amanda's work written into campus memory by those who would not let the file be closed. It read, "A system capable of retaining signal in a fluid lattice will, when uninterfered with, decay to baseline. The persistence of perception is proportional to the pressure gradient and the geometry of confinement. Where structure collapses, the echo collapses with it. Where structure is restored to something living, noise becomes wind again." The footnote cited a single source, Donovan C. Personal observation, 2010. Erin printed the page and tucked it behind the photograph of the kitchen that no one had ever taken. She didn't need an image. She had the hum logged in muscle memory, the way a house keeps the sound of a stair that always creaked. People sent her letters asking what it meant, the quiet, the lack of anniversary flickers, the absence of breathing pits in the counties where sinkholes had opened. She wrote back one sentence and mailed it to each of them on paper, because screens introduce hums of their own. It means we get to choose what we build over what we buried. The last signature, when it came, was not hers to take. In June, Ellen Donovan walked the edge of the field at dusk and left a single blue wildflower tucked in the fence where anyone could see and no one could pocket. The stem wilted in the heat, then dried, then fell, and the grass took the space without ceremony. In August, the cottonwood dropped its first yellow leaves onto ground that was only ground. In November, on the evening of the 22nd, the town's lights burned without flicker. The televisions played through their programming, and the weather stations recorded nothing but the normal whisper of temperature and the basic math of pressure. Erin poured 2 glasses of wine at her own table and set one across from her, while the casserole cooled and the timer chimed. She spoke aloud into the room, because rooms are not wrong when they hold words. "We heard you." The corner of the glass held a tiny condensation bead, and it trembled, then slid, as ordinary as a day in which a mother slept through to morning. The recorder on the table, turned off, did not capture the quiet. Quiet needs no witness. It is the point.